Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session about steering 365 Copilot to your company's APIs with a custom plugin. First, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Roland Bodenstaff. I live in the Netherlands, and I'm an Azure cloud developer for InSpark. InSpark is a company which specializes in everything in the Microsoft ecosystem. You can find me on these socials. I also blog sometimes, so you can see my blog at robot.dev. But the first thing I want to talk to you about is all the different kinds of copilots there are. Of course, the most known is the copilot we're going to talk about today is the 365. But you also have copilot for security, Bing, the consumer market, so Bing, Edge, and for Windows. You even have copilot for Fabric now, Dynamics, Azure, so you can ask how your VMs are doing. And of course, my personal favorite, GitHub Copilot. It's owned by Microsoft, so I use that almost every day in my day-to-day work. And I would like to talk to you about what can you actually do with 365 Copilot. Well, maybe this sounds familiar. You get home, you're back from your holiday, and you get forwarded an email, which is like a 2 week long email thread, and it just says, "Can you fix this?" Well, normally you would just start reading and start figuring out what the actual issue is. But now you can just simply ask Copilot to, hey, summarize this email and tell me what the actual issue seems to be. But I also often use it as a writer's block resolver because it integrates with PowerPoint and Excel, Word, and Teams. You can easily ask it, hey, could you maybe put on some slides about this and this subject, and I want to discuss this and this, so I can have a great first start to my new project. Okay, but let's take a helicopter view at how Copilot actually works. At the top left, you can see the front end where the app, at least the user interacts with Copilot. So you can see the Office apps, Teams, and the user first prompts Copilot with a question. Copilot then sends it to the graph, checks in with the Graphs API because it has really deep connections with it to check, okay, which user is talking to me, what is their chat history, their meetings, and so on. This then gets sent back to the large language model and modifies the prompts, retracts, subtracts the important data, and gives that back to Copilot, and eventually it goes back to another grounding. For example, maybe we need to search for some user contact information like email, and then finally the user gets its response. But this is only for data that is already in 365, within your mailbox or within your SharePoint files. But what if you had a database which contained all the coffee that your employees have drank today? How can you make Copilot access this data and give a valid response to us? So how can you take the steering wheel of Copilot? It looks very complicated, like an F1 steering wheel, but actually it's not as complicated at all. First, you have options. I will shortly discuss three right now. The first one is graph connectors. Graph connectors is a whole subject in itself, but you can see it as you can push data into the Graph API, and a lot of 365 services can then access this data that has made been available. Power Platform is also a very easy way to create custom plugins, or at least make Copilot access companies' data. So that very low code way of doing things. But as a software developer and having experience with building 365 Teams and Teams apps, the message extension was the right fit for me. It gives you the most flexibility and the most control of how your code actually works. For those who are not familiar with message extensions, they're tiny apps that live inside 365 apps that can be used in 365 apps that just display a very basic user interface with some adaptive cards as the graphical interface. You can just put it in a chat and, for example, request some data. And this is the option we are going to use today. Okay, but I can hear you thinking, how do I make Copilot choose when I ask him something about our employees of how many coffee they drank, that it goes to my API instead of some random email from 4 years ago that was about buying coffee? Well, let's take a look back at the helicopter view. It's still the same. At first, when we enable our plugin in Copilot, something happens. The user prompts still the same, but after that, the Copilot immediately detects, hey, I've already read in this plugin, I already know what it does, so I'm not going to the Graph API. No, I immediately go to the API specified, the API it knows about. That then sends the response, and Copilot sends it to the LLM to be processed. After that, it will still go to the grounding step, so it still can get contact data or whatever is needed, and finally the user gets his response. Okay, there are multiple ways you can create a Copilot plugin. The code based, the message extension based. But what we are going to use is the Visual Studio 2022 template in the preview version. This is only available in preview. It's a .NET Azure function, and it has an open API spec so that Copilot knows which functions it can call. It also uses the Teams toolkit to easily encapsulate the app into a package and can run just by pressing F5 in Teams. So after you've installed the preview version of Visual Studio, please make sure you have the ASP.NET Web Development workload installed, and also, as you can see on the right, the Microsoft Teams development tools also selected and installed. Then you can go to, when you've finished installing those, you can go to the options in Visual Studio and enable the Develop Copilot plugin. And as a final step, to get started quickly, we will use this default Teams app template. And when you select the Teams app template, click on the Search Results API, which is just a simple Azure function and a new API that just delivers a default implementation for you. Okay, enough talk. Let's go into the demo. Here we have Visual Studio booted up and the project, the newly created project, opened. There are a few files I would like to show you, which are the most important ones. First, we have the manifest.json, which can be found under the app package directory. For those that are already known with Teams app development, this is a very important file, where you specify the name, you give a short description of it, and what it actually is. For example, here we have the compose extension property, in which you can specify the message extensions in your app. As you can see, this one is API based. And because of that, we need to specify a YAML file with the OpenAPI specification in it. Let's open that file. As you can see, this is just a regular OpenAPI 3.0 spec file in which we have one path defined, a get operation. It's really important because this YAML file is actually loaded into Copilot so that Copilot knows which functions it can call to respond to a request of the user. So here we have one, and the description is very important. Copilot will try to match something with this certain description, if this certain description is specified by the user. It also then knows, oh, I need to provide in the query string a count parameter. I know what the count parameter do and what kind of type it is. And and Copilot also knows what it can receive as a response. So the amounts of cups of coffee the employee has had. So it's a name property of the employee and the cups per day. Just to show you that this is just a regular old function, a regular Azure function. As you can see, there's nothing here that has any resemblance to knowing things about Copilot. The Azure function doesn't even need to know it's being called by Copilot. So as you can see here, we pass the count parameter, we parse it, and from our mock database, we just get the amounts of users that have had more than those amounts of cups of coffee. Okay, well, do make sure that when you are running this, that you are logged into Visual Studio. And because Copilot runs in the cloud, it needs to be able to access your computer. Luckily, Visual Studio has a new feature for that, and it's called dev tunnels. You can easily create your own dev tunnel, and it will just be a link that will redirect to your local machine. Do make it public so it's easily accessible for Copilot. Okay, when we specify that, we can simply run our application. We will wait for it to boot up. What's very important to know is that we need to enable our plugin so that Copilot knows which plugin are actually available at this time. So now we can ask it a question. For example, get the employees that have had at least 4 cups of coffee. Just to show you that it's actually being called, you can see here the HTTP trigger has been called by Copilot and it returns the data. But actually, Copilot can do more. We can also, if we specify the question enough, like we do here, not only do we ask to get the employees who have had more than 4 cups of coffee, we also specify that they want to format the data in the table with the name, the cups of coffee, and the email address of the employee. So now we will not only go to our API, but also when it receives a response, try to ground it using the Graph API. So now it will look for the email addresses. And as you can see, we now also get the email address of the user. Okay, now to round out this talk about Copilot plugins, I would like to give you some helpful tips. As I already said before, make sure your command description is very clear, and also try to test out what works and what doesn't work. The first time, Copilot might not even call your API because your command description is not properly formatted. When you receive um, 500 errors, internal server errors, it most likely has something to do with when your API is not actually being called yet. Most likely, this will be because you have certain characters that are not supported by Copilot in the OpenAPI spec. For example, single quotes, it doesn't really like that much. Also, chaining, so first get a response from one endpoint and then trying to make it call the other endpoint after that. At the time of recording, isn't supported, so don't waste a lot of hours on it. And this is more of a good to know for your company. When you say you press the feedback button, do know that the entire conversation will be sent to Microsoft for to be analyzed. So please be careful with that information. So this was my talk. I hope you've learned something. And if you have any further question, please feel free to contact me using LinkedIn. And thank you for your time.